but for me, that's been one of the biggest benefits of discovering THC and using cannabis is just the way that it's really impacted my ability to just fall asleep. And that has been, I mean, it's changed my life. Like, it's been incredibly valuable.
Welcome to Living in the Weeds, a series that explores the lived experiences of neurodivergent people who consume cannabis, with your hosts, Jessica of Jessica Riley Writer and Lucy of Lucy's Natural Remedies. Today's guest is Cate Osborn. Cate is a neurodivergence educator and is better known as Catieosaurus on all parts of the internet.
Hi everybody, my name is Cate Osborn. I go by Catieosaurus on all corners of the internet. I am a neurodivergent educator and advocate. In particular, my area of special interest is the intersection of neurodivergency and intimacy and relationships and sex. And I kind of got my start doing all of this. I'm going to be honest, purely out of spite. I was a very late diagnosed neurodivergent individual. I found out that I had ADHD the day before my 30th birthday. And I found myself so frustrated with the lack of information and really just discussions that focused on ADHD as sort of a lifetime thing, not just a thing that affects you, in school or during email responses. And so I started sort of researching, and the more that I researched, the more that I wanted to talk about it. And the more that I talked about it, the more my platform kind of grew. And now it is the honor of my life to get to do this for my job. So that's me.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, I'm a huge fan of your channels and all of the media that you've put out. You're talking about being diagnosed before you were 30. I was almost 44 when I got the diagnosis. So I definitely understand that bitter reflection and going back and being like, oh, why was my life like this? In particularly when it comes to smoking cannabis, right? When I first got high, well, the first time I smoked, I didn't really get high because it never actually works that way, right? But the first time I actually kind of felt the effects and realized I could go out and talk to people and not hear this loud voice in my head, just being like, with all of the anxiety that I had and all of the different thoughts that was going on, those were keeping me from moving forward. And then when I started smoking weed, I was like, these are a lot quieter up here now. And I feel a little bit more confident in how my mouth is going to work and that my words are going to come out sounding correctly and whatnot. So how about you? Did you have that connection? What was the first time that you got high? How did that feel like? And when was the first time that you smoked cannabis and you're like, wait a second, this is affecting me differently than my neurotypical friends?
Well, I will preface this by saying that I live in Georgia, where it is not currently legal. So obviously and hypothetically, all of this is only happening in places where it's legal. Obviously, it's only when I'm in California or Illinois or New York. Obviously, of course. But what I would say is my first experience with cannabis was in college. Like, I was not cool in high school, so it was in college. And that was like one of the first times where I realized, I think that I started really feeling my neurodivergency. At the time, I didn't know that I was neurodivergent. I just knew that I was struggling with these sort of very specific things. And so using cannabis, kind of like what you said, was kind of the same thing for me, where it worked as both sort of a anxiety reducer. I don't want to say a confidence builder, but I would say like that sort of social anxiety element was eased for me. And what has been really interesting for me as I sort of transitioned out of college and sort of into adulthood and then learning all about, neurodivergence, is that just really mixed research and really mixed bag of sort of what's the word that I want? Mixed bag of results that we see when we look at studies about things like cannabis use with ADHD or autism or just neurodivergence in general, because there's not really one good cohesive answer. And so I think that's something that is really important to say, like right across the bat, or right off the bat, I guess I should say, is that your results may vary. Like for some people, it seems like cannabis can be an incredibly useful tool. For other people, it might not be, and that's okay too. And then a lot of times too, it's just like how you are using, what you are using, all of those things as well. But it's really interesting to me how there can be such a vast sort of accumulation of experiences with like I'm going to say a distinctive lack of scientific support or research. But then I'll spare you my medical biases rant, but we can do that next podcast.
No, it's sorry, go ahead.
That's really interesting that you brought that up, Katie, because the results do vary. And I think one of the reasons that we don't see a better medical consensus on this is because of the customization of cannabis, the way you can dial it into which cannabinoids work for you. Is it THC? Is it CBD? Is it CBG? Is it CBN? And then how are you taking this? Are you smoking it? Are you taking an edible? Are you doing a tincture? Are you applying a topical? There's so many different ways you can try it that, if you smoke a joint of 25% THC, that's probably not going to help you. You're probably going to feel more anxious and more socially awkward and less put together, but maybe that's just not it.
Yeah, well, I love that you said that too, because I can actually finally officially say this. This is one of the first podcasts I've gotten to say this on, but I have gotten a book deal. I'm writing a book. I'm very excited about it.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It feels fake. It just does not feel real yet. But one of the things that we're talking about is cannabis and just sort of like non-pharmaceutical solutions to ADHD. But yeah, so like all of the research that kind of exists is specifically about THC. And so the other research outside of that very specific type of cannabis use is it just doesn't exist. And so I'm trying to like write a book chapter on, hey, maybe CBD will help you sleep or something, but I can't back it up with any science because the only sort of reporting that we have are like Reddit threads, which surprisingly the scientific community does not consider valid. So it's frustrating. It's frustrating as an educator because it's one of the most popular questions that I get is about cannabis and ADHD. And the problem is twofold. One, every single time I've ever tried to talk about it on my platform, the video gets pulled immediately. Like it's 1 minute, like maybe 100 people see it, those lucky 100, and then it gets pulled down. But then also just the absolute lack of consensus when it comes to things. But I think it's exactly right. Like there are so many options, and as it's become more legalized and we see the industry sort of growing and developing new and interesting ways to use THC, it's like, what are we actually studying?
Yeah.
And that's frustrating to me as a person who likes to know things. So
one thing that we've seen throughout the series so far is people are using not just CBD, but CBG, which is one of the minor cannabinoids, and it's becoming a little bit more well-known. I've heard it more and seen more articles about it, but it allows people to have a bit of that focus that we might need some assistance with. But also like a diet THC, because it also helps with just kind of a mood stabilization, right? You're feeling that goodness that you get from THC, right? That euphoric effect, but not so intensely. It's overridden by this focus that you get. And so something, if you're looking to dive into cannabis and ADHD, don't sleep on the other little minor cannabinoids, because they really have an impact. For me, I really find that full spectrum hemp has been helpful because it gives me access to those other minor cannabinoids, and it's legal in almost all of the United States. There's a couple of states that have decided that full spectrum hemp is still a no-no. But that's something that for me has been helpful. Do you have a preference in terms of THC, CBD? What have you found under the cannabinoids that help you with your ADHD?
It's funny because my instant answer was, here's what doesn't.
But
and again, it's so interesting living in Georgia because we have this really interesting sort of gray area where like THC proper like is not legal, but we have a lot of the sort of like replacements and like synthetics like the Delta 8s, and I think they're up to like Delta 9. It's like Land Before Time. There's like 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 now or whatever.
Oh God.
And so those have been like very interesting because like for science, I have tried many of those. And what I have found generally is that all of those synthetics don't produce the same effects as that sort of very non-synthetic, I will say. But then also I guess like my experience is far more on the edible range of things. I'm a person who I just struggle sort of physically with the act of smoking. And so a friend was like, hey, you might like edibles. And so for me, a big thing that I found really helped more than anything was that edibles really helped me with sleep. Because, fun fact, did you know that about 90% of people with ADHD have some sort of issue with sleep, going to sleep, falling asleep? About 70% of people with ADHD have delayed sleep phase syndrome, which means that it takes about 3 hours longer for us to fall asleep than people without ADHD, which is kind of wild. And so when you start looking at sort of options, there's obviously like the pharmaceutical kind, but there's also the sort of more natural kind, which just like feels better in my body. Like I would rather rely on that than I would like a sleep aid. Now that's not to say that if you use sleep aids, you're bad and wrong and that there's anything good for that or bad about that. Like please use what is right for you. But for me, that's been one of the biggest benefits of discovering THC and using cannabis is just the way that it's really impacted my ability to just fall asleep. And that has been, I mean, it changed my life. Like it's been incredibly valuable.
Yeah, no.
I hope that's an answer.
No, it is. It is. Sleep is something that I think, just like you mentioned, like we don't think about that as a thing that we deal with ADHD, right? Because some like insomnia seems to be so common, right? It's rampant. Everybody has it. And you're like, no, I don't think you understand. Like, I know I was physically in that bed for 6 hours and I might have looked like I was unconscious, but I was actually kind of awake, right? Yeah. And it's this weird sensation where it's like the brain just doesn't stop. I don't know about you, but I have like almost lucid dreams where if I'm extremely stressed out, an event will happen in my dream, right? And then I'll play it. I mean, like I remember in high school, I would show up to dance practice with my clothes and my gym teacher's like, what are you doing here? I'm like, we don't have practice, do we? She's like, no. I'm like, the performance is coming up. I was stressed out. Like, I mean, telling my carpoolers, like, you don't have a ride today. Because, I mean, like, that's the level of lack of sleep or quality of sleep that was impacting my life. Yeah. And like, it's great that we have edibles because that ends up, because your liver becomes involved with it, it takes 6 to 8 hours to leave your system, right? So whereas with your smoking something, that can take 2 hours, 3 hours tops to leave your system completely. And even then towards the end, you're not really feeling it, right? But you take an edible and it's good night.
I think it's so interesting that sleep is not one of the things that we necessarily consider a neurodivergency system. But when you look at it from a medical standpoint, your endocannabinoid system has a huge amount of control over your hormonal regulation and your circadian rhythm. And there's a lot of studies that suggest that neurodivergence is an endocannabinoid system dysregulation problem, so that you are inherently dysregulated in your circadian rhythm, in your hormonal production, in when that melatonin is coming out. So something like edibles can help normalize that.
Yeah, absolutely. And like when we talk about neurodivergence, I think raising those things is really important to talk about because so often we talk about neurodivergence as dysfunction or, you know, just sort of this idea of like there's something inherently wrong with us. But the more research that comes out, we really are seeing that things like sleep disturbances, sleep cycles, hormonal interactions, like those kind of things, those have a much, much larger impact on neurodivergence than I think we knew for a really long time. And so now when we start having these conversations about, okay, well then how does that interact with something like cannabis or whatever the topic may be, it's really fascinating to see that we're now sort of starting to reframe that conversation as less of a deficit mindset, but also and the causality may be something that could absolutely be supported by something like THC or other like natural remedies. And I think that's like kind of cool.
Yeah, no, it's, and the fact that every year we're getting, I feel like, a little bit closer to where the laws just finally make sense. It's interesting, that you're in Georgia and it's still, illegal, but Georgia's sitting there looking at putting THC in their pharmacies. Like so it's just like, soon? Soon can we go to the store? So you were mentioning at the start that, you concentrate a lot on sex and ADHD. And so like for me, one of the hurdles, pre-diagnosis was the fact that it was very hard for me to be intimate with somebody if I wasn't high. And it became a problem in certain relationships, right? I remember one boyfriend was like, do you always have to get high before we have sex? And my immediate voice, the sound in my head was like, yes. But I was like, I can't say that. Right. Because, I'm a little on the older side. So I still have very much the stigma of like cannabis is like heroin. I'm a drug addict. Right. And I'm constantly facing that battle internally to be like, no, this is a beautiful natural plant that, unfortunately, Nancy Reagan told you all to just say no for so many years that it was part of that, right? So when I was looking at some of your content on TikTok of sex and ADHD, it was so validating to me because it was something that even as much as like recognizing the fact that was a thing made it so that I didn't have to be high anymore. Like it's, for me at least, I don't know if that's something for you all, where it's like once you identify and intellectualize the issue, then you're like, oh, that's why my brain works that way. Well, I can just tell it to shut the fuck up and move forward. Is that something that you had, were you using cannabis as part of your intimacy to be able to help with ADHD characteristics? I don't like using the word symptoms because it seems so medicinal. So I'm like, they're characteristics.
Yes, short answer, yes. And it's really interesting too, because that entire conversation about, I need to be a little bit high, or I need to have a glass of wine or something like that, like it gets so complicated so quickly, because I'm very much in the camp of like like cannabis, alcohol, like they're tools. Like there are tools that can be misappropriated. There are tools that can be used very appropriately and provide really excellent supports in some capacities. But then it's like that question of like use and how much and how often and all of that stuff that like you need to worry about, right? But for a lot of neurodivergent people, I hear that all the time. Like I need to be a little bit high, or I need to have a glass of wine in order to relax, or whatever that may be. And so I always like to say that when we have these conversations, that's okay. That's an okay thing. Again, as long as it's something healthy, as long as you're not, using to the point of, causing concern or consternation. But for some people, that quieting of the mind, or that developing that internal connection from brain to body, a lot of times over the years, neurodivergent people will develop trauma and I don't want to say like blockages, because that sounds like they're like constipated, but like, a difficulty, I shall say, a difficulty connecting brain and body. And sometimes things like cannabis can be a really productive way of retraining your body and retraining your brain to embrace it. And then you get to a point like you, where you go, oh, and you know what? I can just kind of like talk myself through that now. I can self-coach, I can self-regulate, I can self-moderate to the point where I'm feeling safe and I'm feeling comfortable. But for some people, maybe they need an edible, and that's okay too,
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's something that you don't think about necessarily. And like, my lens is from somebody who had a very late diagnosis. So a lot of these things were, character flaws for me for many for decades, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like coming back and looking back at it and being like, hey, that's okay. That was like, those were my glasses, if you will, that I needed to be able to move through the bedroom life or whatnot, or to be able to socialize, or depending on the strain. Some strains like do you have any thoughts on, like, since you're in a state that's not legal necessarily, you might not have found your favorite terpene yet, but do you have one?
I was gonna say, I was like, man, I feel like such like the dorky, awkward kid at a cool kids party. I was like, I don't know. But I think that, honestly, I'm gonna turn that into something educational. Like, I think one of the most powerful things that has come out of the sort of like broad legalization of cannabis is that people have the opportunity to do that. Like, you're not just smoking, just like whatever you can get from the gas station parking lot or whatever, and I think that is something that's really important, especially again when we come back to that idea that like not every strain is going to be for every person, not every strain is going to support or offer the same accommodations, and so I think a big part of the conversation of neurodivergence and like cannabis use as a whole is that kind of educating yourself, right? And like going out of your way to try different strains, try different types, unless you're like me and you live in a state where you can't. So it's like I went to California and I had a really fun couple of weeks, and then I came back to Georgia where I sat in my house and was sad. But yeah, no, I wish I had the opportunity to do that. And I'm moving out to LA, and so I'm honestly like really looking forward to that, of being able to explore that a lot more.
Yeah, no, I lived in Texas and Louisiana before I moved back here to the DC area. And when I moved back and it was, medicinal and there were dispensaries, it was amazing. I remember I went in and I bought 12 different types, and I came home and just like laid them all out and just compared all the colors and the consistency and smelled them. And I was just like, this is like Christmas in September. Oh my God.
Man,
it's that education that we're missing. It's for people who are late diagnosed, it's that education on your brain, education on why you are the way that you are, that these things are not character flaws, that they're not something that's wrong with you. And then you can dive into, okay, based on what I know about myself and my neurodivergence, let's get to know my endocannabinoid system and what serves my endocannabinoid system to help me manage my neurodivergence and maximize these things that I thought were detriments.
Yeah, absolutely. And just finding a really good bud tender who knows their stuff too. Like worth their weight in gold, a good bud tender.
Yeah, no, definitely. But like the endocannabinoid system really needs to be studied more. I'm going to stand on my little soapbox here for a second, just because like it's found in everything with a spine. And I think I read an article somewhere, maybe I dreamt it, who knows, with my lucid dreams, that jellyfish even have endocannabinoid systems. But like it's something that regulates, digestion, mood, sleep, so many things, right? It helps with your inflammation, which in turn helps with pain. Being able to understand it and understand why something that would make me, spin out work for you. Like, how does that happen? How does that work out? And I think it's important for people who are on this journey right now, trying to understand how to use cannabis, right? If you've used it for a couple of tries and they've been more on the indica side and they didn't work for you, if you ended up being like me and fall asleep instantly, like it's okay to go back and try it again. It's okay to say, hey, maybe edibles didn't work for me, but tinctures do, right? Or maybe tinctures and edibles don't work at all. I don't like smoking. Okay, here's a vape pen. Let me try that, right? Like there's so many different ways to medicate these days, and to be able to consume that. And we were talking about this earlier, how that actually also impacts how it affects you. Jess, I know you like edibles more as well, right? If I remember correctly.
I'm a big smoker because I need that immediate titration a lot of the time. If I'm smoking, it's, to stimulate my appetite or to give me some focus or to help me calm down and meditate and journal and deal with anxiety. Edibles, they can be a little unpredictable for me.
But see,
Also,
go ahead.
Oh no, sorry, you go ahead, please.
But I was just going to say, so Cate, with you're saying that you prefer the edibles because they're helping you with the sleep part in the sleep cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like a little bit that maybe this is like shoehorning a metaphor in where it does not necessarily belong. But I really like this conversation as also a really good sort of illustration of just neurodivergency as a whole. Like a lot of times I think people tend to think of neurodivergence as like a scale, right? A scale of like 1 to 10. Do you have a lot of ADHD? Are you a little autistic? And that's a fallacy, right? Because neurodivergency is a spectrum. And even if you take, one person with ADHD and directly compare them to another person with ADHD, those two people are going to have, by nature of their upbringing, by nature of their neurodivergence, by nature of their lived experiences, different strengths and different weaknesses. And then you get to sort of the comorbidity conversation, which is like where I spend a lot of my time, where it's, about 40% of people with ADHD are also autistic, whether or not they have been diagnosed. Then it's like depression and anxiety and substance use disorders, gambling, hoarding, eating disorders. Like there's a lot of stuff that goes into neurodivergence that isn't necessarily just the neurodivergency itself, if that makes sense. So that creates for each individual brain a huge variance of a huge spectrum of strengths and weaknesses and preferences and lived experiences. And so when we're talking about this idea of like, oh, this thing, parentheses, cannabis, can help, it's yes, but for a person with ADHD and autism and depression and anxiety, their needs, their support needs, and what they may or may not be able to use something like cannabis for is going to be dramatically different than the person standing next to them who is also, autistic, who also has ADHD, but doesn't necessarily deal with anxiety or depression. And that's why talking about neurodivergence is so difficult, because it's 99% of the time it is not just one thing. Like you're not just ADHD. And so that's big. That's a big thing to talk about.
Yeah.
But I hope that makes sense. I was trying to make sense there at the end.
Yeah. I think when I was on my ADHD journey, just reconciling with the fact that this is something that I could have possibly been dealing with my whole life. Somebody very close to me sent me like a pie chart. And it was a pie chart of symptoms, for lack of a better term. And it was when I saw it as a pie chart that's like some people have more anxiety, or some people have more time blindness, or some people have more executive dysfunction, whereas some people have more rigid thinking and other people don't deal with that at all. The pie chart was like, oh, okay, it's all of these symptoms, but it's not just like a scale of 1 to 10. It's your individual makeup of these symptoms that come together to create your beautiful neurodivergent palette, whatever that looks like.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, for me, I ended up coming in backwards, right? So I was diagnosed with clinical depression and anxiety throughout all of that time. And it was like, we couldn't find the medication to work. And it was just constant going back and forth and back and forth. And then I stumbled across your TikToks and a couple of others. And I was like, I remember there was one that you talked about in terms of object permanence, right? And how everybody talks about object permanence in terms of like, oh, where did I put this? It's out of sight, out of mind. But when you talked about it in terms of relationships with friends, and you're like, this is the ball, I don't see it anymore. What if that ball was your friend's text message that she didn't respond to, right? Like, what happens when that kicks in? And you kind of connected a lot of dots for me in that moment. And I was like, okay, I remember thinking that was anxiety, and it was because I was feeling anxious over the situation. But what was causing it was my ADHD. Right? And so it's like, once I figured out that it was the ADHD that was causing it, anytime that situation pops in, I'm like, oh, wait, that's right. I don't feel time the same way that other people do. Right? Like sometimes 5 minutes feels like 5 hours. Sometimes 5 minutes feels like 5 seconds. And it's interesting once you figure that part out, right? And then like, I have to say, cannabis doesn't necessarily help for me when it comes to time blindness, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because it already causes your perceptions to be off. So like, if you've been, if you're watching this and you're smoking and you're like, time blindness, that's just because I have stoner time. Maybe it's not stoner time. Maybe it's a matter of you literally, your body, your cells feel time differently based on the circumstances, right? That you're feeling in that moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's actually been a ton of research about time perception deficits in people with ADHD, and they're real. Like it's there are studies, there are a bunch of them. I just read a whole bunch of them for the book, and it's really interesting. And so when we talk about stuff like that, I really like that you said that sometimes cannabis won't work, because like another personal example for me is that my thing was anxiety. Like I for a long time didn't know that I had anxiety. I thought everybody worried this much all the time about everything, and I was like, oh, that's just part of being a person, you know. And for me, like finding out I had ADHD was like, yeah, obviously, look around you, you know. But treating my anxiety was what genuinely became the catalyst towards me really improving my life and becoming sort of like the best version of myself, because the anxiety what was what was causing more of the issues than anything else. And so now when I use cannabis, I have to be like, and what about anxiety? Because that's what will send me spiraling, you know. Like that's the thing that will really be counterproductive and can oftentimes be damaging. And so there have been times where I've tried like certain strains or like certain, you know, brands of edibles or whatever, and I go, oh, actually that one might not be for me. That actually made this a lot worse than better, and that's not what we're looking for. And so yeah, I'm a big supporter of experimenting to support what you personally have going on, rather than treating it as like a one size fits all sort of solution.
A good actionable tip for anybody who is trying to figure out the cannabis routine that works for them: keep CBD tincture on hand. Full spectrum, isolate, doesn't matter. CBD tincture is one of the best ways to deal with anxiety from THC overconsumption. And it is a huge benefit as you're worried about what strains may or may not pique your anxiety, to have that on hand and know if you start to get too high, if you start to go to the shadow realm and all the mean thoughts are coming in your head, take some CBD tincture, take some deep breaths, and wait, because it will pass.